Tonight, we trace the shadow of the Siberian mystic who walked into the innermost chamber of Imperial Russia and never quite left. His name was Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin. He was not a monk, though history calls him one. He was not a sorcerer, though his enemies swore he must be. He was a peasant, a wanderer, a healer of uncertain gifts, and a mirror, perhaps the most unflattering mirror the Romanov dynasty ever had to face. And when they tried to shatter that mirror on a December night in Petrograd, they found to their horror that the empire was already broken. History keeps its secrets in strange places. In the frost-cracked earth of Siberia, in the perfumed drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, in the black water beneath a bridge on a winter night in 1916, some lives are so tangled with the fate of nations that the man and the myth become inseparable. And the truth, stranger than either, gets buried beneath both. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. This is the story of how one man's life echoed through the collapse of 300 years of Russian autocracy. And why, more than a century later, that echo has not yet faded. We begin, as all Russian stories seem to, in the cold. The village of Pokrovskoye sits along the Tura River in western Siberia. In the second half of the 19th century, it was exactly what you might imagine. Scattering of wooden houses, deeply religious, hard-laboring, subject to winters that could silence a man permanently if he forgot their nature. Into this world, Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born on January 22, 1869, the son of Yefim Rasputin, a peasant farmer and sometime village official, and Anna Parshukova. His childhood was ordinary in the ways that mattered and strange in the ways that stuck. There is a persistent legend that as a boy he possessed some uncanny ability to sense the dishonest and heal the sick. But most of what we know about his early years comes filtered through later accounts, his own, his daughter Maria's, and those of contemporaries. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that he grew up in a devout Orthodox household, received minimal formal education, and by his teenage years had a reputation in Pokrovskoye for being what we might charitably call difficult, wild-tempered, given to drink, involved in petty theft. He was, by local account, not a young man destined for sainthood. In 1887, at the age of 18, he married Praskovia Fyodorovna Dubrovina, a peasant woman who would remain his wife until his death. This is a detail that tends to vanish from popular retellings, where Rasputin is portrayed as a man untethered from ordinary domestic life. In reality, he and Praskovia had several children together. She remained in Pokrovskoye while her husband wandered. A fact that says something about the particular kind of man he was, present and absent at the same time. The wandering began in earnest around 1890, and it was not random. Something shifted in Rasputin during these years. He'd spent time at the Verkhovny Monastery in the Ural Mountains, where he came into contact with the tradition of Russian mystical Christianity. This tradition emphasized direct personal communion with the divine, unmediated by the formal church hierarchy. He emerged from this period a changed man, or at least a man who presented himself differently. He had traded the village reprobate for something harder to categorize: a strannik, a holy wanderer. He traveled on foot between monasteries and shrines, supported by the alms of the faithful, bearing a calling from God. He undertook pilgrimages of remarkable endurance. He reportedly walked to the great Orthodox monastery of Abalak. He eventually made his way to the holy sites of Greece and to Jerusalem. These were not casual journeys. It required years and thousands of miles of walking through conditions that would exhaust most people. Whatever else Rasputin was, he had physical stamina and a conviction about his own spiritual purpose that no hardship appeared to diminish. He also had something rarer and harder to quantify. He could talk to people, now, not in the polished way of the educated, but in a raw, immediate, personal way that seemed to reach people where they actually lived. He spoke of God not as an institution, but as an intimate, a relationship forged in mud and cold and suffering, not in marble cathedrals. For the peasants of Russia, who had lived their entire lives being addressed from above, this was extraordinary. For the aristocrats who would later encounter him in St. Petersburg, it was first exotic and then alarming. He arrived in the capital around 1903 or 1904, and he arrived with introductions. The network of Russian Orthodoxy was vast and interconnected, and Rasputin had cultivated relationships with bishops and archimandrites. In particular, he had impressed Bishop Theophan of St. Petersburg, a man of unimpeachable personal piety. Theophan genuinely believed he had encountered something spiritually authentic in this peasant from Pokrovskoye. Theophan introduced Rasputin to the city's religious and aristocratic circles. Where curiosity about mysticism was high, St. Petersburg, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city in the grip of a peculiar anxiety. The revolutionary movement was gaining strength. The established church felt increasingly remote from genuine spiritual life. Among the aristocracy, there was a widespread hunger for something that transcended the formal and the official. Into this atmosphere stepped a large, dark-eyed Siberian peasant who spoke of God as though he knew him personally. He was, to put it plainly, irresistible to a certain kind of seeking soul. His reputation preceded him, a man who had healed the sick, who could see into the human heart. He carried about him an almost physical sense of spiritual intensity. His physical appearance struck almost everyone. A tall, broad-shouldered figure with unkempt hair and an enormous beard, dressed in peasant clothes that in the gilded rooms of St. Petersburg seemed almost aggressive in their plainness. And the eyes, everyone wrote about his eyes, large, pale, blue, or gray, fixed upon you with an attention that felt, depending on who was doing the feeling, either illuminating or deeply unsettling. The imperial family's introduction to Rasputin came through a network of ecclesiastical and aristocratic connections. By 1905, Rasputin had made contact with Militsa and Anastasia, Montenegrin princesses interested in mysticism. They brought him to the attention of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra. Their first recorded meeting occurred on November 1, 1905. To understand what happened next, one must grasp Alexandra Fyodorovna's particular anguish. Born a German princess, Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt, she embraced Russian Orthodoxy with intense devotion. She was a devoted wife and mother, deeply private and unsuited to court life, with a rigid character. The birth of Tsarevich Alexei in August 1904 should have been the fulfillment of everything. Instead, it inaugurated a nightmare for the Romanov dynasty. Within weeks, it became apparent Alexei had inherited hemophilia through his mother's line. Any injury, any bruise, any minor bleeding could become life-threatening. There was no treatment. Nicholas and Alexandra watched their son, the future of their dynasty, live in the shadow of death. The hemophilia was a state secret. To speak of it openly was to admit the dynasty's vulnerability. Alexandra managed this terror largely alone, her letters revealing sustained private grief. She turned increasingly to faith as the only available consolation. It was in this context that Rasputin was brought to the boy. The exact mechanism by which Rasputin alleviated Alexei's episodes has been debated ever since. The historical record shows that when Alexei suffered a crisis, Rasputin's presence brought relief. Episodes of screaming pain that went on for days would subside. In some instances, simply a telegram from Rasputin appeared to bring relief. The boy would calm. The bleeding would slow or stop. The crisis would pass. What caused this? Historians and physicians have put forward several possibilities. One theory: Rasputin's ability to calm Alexandra, whose agitation exacerbated Alexei's bleeding. His presence could reduce her stress, indirectly helping the child. Another theory: Rasputin instructed physicians to discontinue aspirin, a blood thinner. Physicians of the time did not know aspirin worsened a hemophiliac's condition. A third points to the power of hypnotic suggestion and induced calm on bleeding episodes. What does not appear in the historical record, once you look carefully, is any supernatural explanation. What does appear is the response of two desperate parents. Nicholas wrote in his diary of being glad Rasputin had come. Alexandra wrote of him as a man sent by God, as their friend, as the one person who reliably brought her son back from the edge. For her, in those moments beside Alexei's bed, Rasputin was not a political figure or a mystic celebrity. He was the reason her child was still alive. This is essential context for everything that follows. The relationship between Rasputin and the imperial family has been luridly misrepresented in popular culture and was viciously misrepresented in the gossip of their own era. The evidence does not support any romantic or sexual component to this relationship. Alexandra's correspondence makes her regard for Rasputin clear. He was her spiritual protector and her son's healer. The relationship was maternal in its deepest character. She called him our friend, wrote to him as a superior spiritual being, and defended him with a ferocity born entirely from the conviction that without him, Alexei would not survive. But the relationship did not exist in a private vacuum. It existed at the center of Imperial Russia, and it could not stay secret. By the late 1900s, Rasputin's access to the imperial family was the most whispered about fact in St. Petersburg society. A Siberian peasant was received in private audience by the Tsar and Empress. He had the ear, apparently, of the throne itself. The combination was to the aristocracy, to the church hierarchy, to the educated public, somewhere between scandalous and terrifying. The rumors that circulated about Rasputin during this period tell us at least as much about his accusers as about him. He was said to lead a secret religious sect, the Klisti, who practiced flagellation and sexual ecstasy as paths to divine grace. He was said to have seduced dozens of women from the highest levels of society. He was said to drink to spectacular excess and behave in ways that disgraced the company of decent men and women. He was said to have compromised the Empress herself. How much of this was true? Some of it in diluted form. Rasputin did drink. He did have relationships with women, a number of them, and his behavior uncertain. Company was coarse in ways that he seemed to regard as the natural expression of a man unimpressed by social pretension. The Klisti accusation was investigated twice by the Holy Synod and twice found unproven. The claim about Alexandra was, the historical evidence strongly suggests, a slander born of political frustration and class contempt. What is harder to dismiss is the political reality that was developing beneath the social gossip. Rasputin was not simply a healer and spiritual presence. He was becoming, whether he sought it or not, a figure of influence. People seeking imperial favor approached him. Ministers sought his goodwill. His opinions on church appointments and even government matters reached Alexandra, and sometimes beyond her. When Prime Minister Stolypin attempted to have Rasputin exiled from St. Petersburg in 1911, Alexandra intervened. Stolypin, one of the most capable administrators of the era, was overruled because of the Empress's conviction that removing Rasputin endangered Alexei. The tension this created was profound. The constitutional government, the traditional aristocracy, the senior military, the Duma, all of them looking at the imperial household and seeing a peasant mystic with apparent veto power over the will of the Tsar. Whatever Rasputin's personal intentions, the spectacle was corrosive to the dignity of the monarchy and to the trust that the governing institutions needed to function. And then the war came. Germany declared war on Russia in August 1914, and the world that had maintained its precarious balance shuddered and began to fall apart. In the first months, there was patriotic unity. Nicholas II appeared in Moscow and St. Petersburg to enormous crowds. The city was renamed Petrograd, the German syllables stripped away. Russia mobilized millions. Rasputin's position on the war is noteworthy and has been somewhat overlooked. He consistently opposed it. He had told Nicholas in writing that the war would bring disaster. He was correct, though his reasoning was theological rather than strategic. The Russian military suffered catastrophic losses through 1914 and 1915, failures of supply, of command, of basic equipment. Soldiers went to the front without rifles. The losses were staggering. By 1915, the situation had become critical enough that Nicholas made the decision that would seal his fate. He went to the front himself, assuming personal command of the Russian army. This decision had been opposed by nearly everyone around him. It was opposed because it was strategically unnecessary. There were capable generals, because it meant that every military reversal from that point forward would be associated directly with the Tsar's personal leadership. But Nicholas went, driven partly by a sense of duty and partly by the same religious fatalism that shaped many of his decisions. A conviction that God's will would make itself known, and that his role was to stand in the appointed place and accept it. His departure left Alexandra as the effective regent in Petrograd, managing civil affairs through the ministers, and it left her to manage those affairs in increasing consultation with Rasputin. The winter of 1915 to 1916 was when the political situation around Rasputin became critical in a new way. Alexandra, isolated from her husband under enormous strain, genuinely believing in Rasputin's spiritual guidance, began to relay his recommendations about ministerial appointments directly to Nicholas. As the letters survive, they are painful reading not because they reveal a scheming Rasputin engineering his own power, but because they reveal an exhausted woman doing her desperate best in a situation she was wholly unprepared for. Relying on the counsel of the one figure she most trusted, the results were disastrous. Between 1915 and 1916, Russia cycled through 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, and 3 foreign ministers. The appointments were often made and unmade on the basis of whether the minister in question was regarded as sympathetic to our friend. The government of a country fighting a world war became a carousel of confused loyalties and personal vendettas, presided over at a distance by a Tsar who was managing a losing military campaign, and at home by an Empress who was being advised partly by a Siberian peasant. The hatred for Rasputin in these months became almost elemental. It crossed political lines. Conservatives who feared revolution despised him as a destabilizing force. Liberals who wanted constitutional reform saw him as the embodiment of autocratic irrationality. The church resented his influence on ecclesiastical appointments. The military associated him with the regime's dysfunction. Members of the extended Romanov family pleaded with Nicholas to remove him. In terms ranging from the diplomatic to the desperate, Nicholas, caught between his wife's absolute conviction and his own political judgment, temporized. By the autumn of 1916, a small group of men had decided to act. The conspirators who gathered to discuss Rasputin's removal were bound together by their status. All connected to the highest levels of Russian society, convinced killing one man would save the empire. The primary architect was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of Russia's wealthiest men, a figure of extraordinary privilege and theatrical personal style, joined by Vladimir Purishkovich, a right-wing Duma member, who spoke against Rasputin, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin of the Tsar. Other participants included British intelligence officer Captain Oswald Rayner, a detail we will return to later. The date was December 16, 1916 by the old-style Russian calendar, December 29th by the Western calendar we use today. Rasputin was lured to Yusupov Palace on the Moika Canal in Petrograd. Under pretext of meeting Yusupov's wife, Irina, he arrived late in the evening. What happened next has been told and retold many times. So many embellished versions, legend has almost consumed reality. The legendary account comes from Yusupov's memoir, a self-dramatization. Rasputin was given cakes and wine laced with cyanide, enough to kill several men. He consumed them with apparent pleasure and felt nothing. He was then shot at close range and fell. But when Yusupov returned, Rasputin's eyes opened. He rose, strangled his attacker, escaped into the courtyard, shot again multiple times, then bound. The autopsy, in Yusupov's version, would supposedly reveal water in the lungs, proof the man had been alive when thrown in. The forensic evidence tells a different story. The investigation found no evidence of poisoning. The body showed multiple gunshot wounds, including one to the forehead, almost certainly the cause of death. There was no water in the lungs. Changes consistent with submersion after death. The bound hands, described as clawing free, were bound with a cord. Forensic analysis suggests this occurred after death. What the evidence actually supports is this: Rasputin was shot, likely more than once, by multiple assailants. The coup de grace, the shot to the forehead, was delivered at very close range. His body was then deposited through a hole in the ice of the Malaya Nevka River. He died of gunshot wounds. He was not poisoned. He did not drown. He was not as Yusupov would have it, a near supernatural being, who took everything the conspirators could throw at him before finally succumbing. The detail about the British intelligence officer, Captain Rayner, is worth noting here, because it has attracted significant attention from researchers, most notably Andrew Cook. The circumstantial evidence. Rayner's documented presence in Petrograd, his known association with Yusupov, the forensic evidence pointing to a third shooter, and British intelligence's concern about Rasputin's anti-war influence on Alexandra, has led some historians to conclude that Rayner may have fired the fatal shot. This remains a matter of scholarly debate, not established fact. But it is a reminder that the assassination of Rasputin was not a simple domestic drama. It was embedded in the geopolitics of a world war.
Yes.
And the great powers were paying very close attention to anything that might affect Russia's continued participation in it. The body was found on December 19th under the ice. It was identified and removed. The conspirators were known almost immediately. There had been witnesses, a discovered overshoe, a blood trail in the snow. Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry were placed under house arrest or exiled to their estates. These were gentle punishments, reflecting something terrible. Nicholas II, in grief, could not treat the murderers of a peasant with full rigor. Alexandra was shattered. Her letters from these days are almost unbearable to read. She had lost the one person who she believed stood between her son and death. She had also lost whatever remained of the monarchy's ability to navigate what was coming. Rasputin was buried on December 21, 1916, at a chapel in Tsarskoye Selo. Alexandra attended with the imperial children. Nicholas arrived shortly afterward. The service was private. The world outside was still at war, revolutionary in its accumulating anger, waiting for the next crack in the ice. It did not wait long. In February 1917, strikes and demonstrations in Petrograd escalated with extraordinary speed. This led to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. Nicholas at the front found himself unable to return. The Duma formed a provisional government. The troops in Petrograd, ordered to fire on protesters, refused. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated not just for himself but for Alexei, citing the child's health. He handed power to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who declined it the following day. 300 years of Romanov rule ended in 72 hours. The family was placed under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo. They were eventually moved east. First to Tobolsk in Siberia, then to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. As the Bolsheviks took power and the civil war intensified. On the night of July 16 to 17, 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, and all 5 of their children were executed. In the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, the dynasty was over. The empire was gone. Those who had killed Rasputin believing that his removal would save the monarchy had been catastrophically wrong. The elements destroying imperial Russia were not reducible to one man's influence. They were structural. An outdated autocracy, a devastating war, decades of suppressed social pressure, a revolutionary movement. Rasputin had not created the crisis. He had, at most, decorated its surface. A visible symbol of the rot that was already far advanced before he ever arrived in St. Petersburg. And yet, the question of his actual influence is genuinely complex, and historians continue to debate it. It seems fair to say that his presence accelerated specific dysfunctions. The ministerial instability, the isolation of the court from its natural political allies, the way in which the gossip about him became a vehicle for the general contempt in which the monarchy was held. Whether a healthier relationship between the imperial family and its advisors could have changed the outcome is unknowable. What we can say is that the particular combination of Alexandra's dependence, Rasputin's access, and Nicholas's inability to manage. The resulting perception was genuinely destructive to the already fragile legitimacy of the throne. The myths that grew around Rasputin after his death are, in their own way, as revealing as the historical facts. The image of the mad monk, immortal poison, immune, riddled with bullets and still struggling, became almost immediately the dominant popular image. It served certain purposes. For the Romanovs' opponents, it confirmed that the imperial family had been in the grip of a supernatural charlatan. For Yusupov and his fellow conspirators, it made their murder into a near-heroic act against something genuinely monstrous. For the general public, it provided a satisfying monster story at a moment when the empire itself was collapsing, a single dark figure, onto whom an enormous amount of complex anxiety could be projected. His daughter Maria, who spent much of her adult life in the West attempting to rehabilitate her father's reputation, described him quite differently. As a man of genuine faith and genuine human failing, deeply kind to those who were suffering, capable of crude and selfish behavior in other contexts, and utterly unlike the supernatural villain of popular legend. Her account, naturally, must be read with the same caution we bring to all family testimony, but it is a useful corrective. What the evidence supports is something more mundane and more interesting than the legend. Rasputin was a man of unusual personal intensity and real spiritual conviction who found himself through a combination of talent, circumstance, and the specific tragedy of a hemophiliac heir, elevated to a position that no one, certainly not he, was equipped to handle wisely. He was neither the saint his most devoted admirers believed him to be, nor the calculating demon his enemies described. He was a Siberian peasant who had walked a long way from Pokrovskoye, and who in the Baroque catastrophe of late imperial Russia became a lightning rod for everything the educated classes feared about the disorder lurking beneath the empire's gilded surface. There is something almost mythic in the shape of his story, which is perhaps why it refuses to become simply history. The outsider who gains access to power. The healer who cannot heal the deeper sickness. The scapegoat whose removal reveals that the thing everyone feared was not one man at all, but the fragility of the entire structure in which he had been given a role. The conspirators killed him and saved nothing. The dynasty fell, and the world that had generated both the Romanovs and the rumors about their strange Siberian confidant was swept away so completely that we can only glimpse it now in photographs, in letters, in the frozen clarity of a winter river. The Yusupov Palace still stands in what is now St. Petersburg. You can visit it. There is a basement room where the killing is said to have occurred. The frozen rivers of the Russian winter still run through the city, dark and inscrutable, carrying their secrets toward the sea. And somewhere in the accumulated record of a life that bent history slightly, a life of pilgrimage and prayer and political misjudgment and genuine human love for a sick child he could not fully cure, Grigori Rasputin remains exactly what he was. Not a monster, not a saint, not an immortal, but a man whose presence at the center of a collapsing world made the collapse visible in ways that history has never quite stopped examining. We have traced his shadow tonight, from the Siberian frost to the palaces of Petrograd, from the nursery of the Tsarevich to the icy river that was meant to swallow him whole. What remains, as always, is the question that history answers only by asking again, was he the cause, or was he the symptom? Was Rasputin the disease that killed the Romanovs? Or was he the fever, the visible sign of something far deeper and far less curable that had been building in the body of imperial Russia for generations before he ever arrived? I leave that question with you, because honestly I think the best historical thinking acknowledges that both things can be true at once. He was a symptom who also made the illness worse. He was a mirror held up to a dynasty that could not bear its own reflection. He was, at the last, a man, which is sometimes the most mysterious thing a person can be. Thank you for spending this hour in the shadows with us. If this story moved you, haunted you, or made you want to argue with something I said, good. That is exactly what this channel is for. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Did Rasputin accelerate the revolution, or was he merely carried along by forces that would have destroyed the Romanovs with or without him? I want to read what you think. If you are new to Whispered Chronicles, and this is your first echo of forgotten lore, subscribe and stay close. We trace the lives that history almost lost, the figures who stood at the edge of great events, and whose stories told properly reveal more about the past than any list of dates and battles ever could. There are many more shadows to follow. The forgotten always have more to say. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.